Hello and welcome back, and everybody, Levi here, and lately I haven't really been liking some of the newer commanders that have been coming out, save for Foundations. I'll be probably making some videos about that coming up soon, but I've been taking a look at some of the older sets. I like to do that from time to time, and recently I took a look at Doctor Who, and I found a really cool and interesting commander I don't see a lot of people building, and it's Danny Pink, 3 and a blue for a 4/3 human soldier advisor with Mentor, which Mentor means whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power, so it grows your army. Also, it has creatures you control have whenever one or more counters are put on this creature for the first time each turn, you draw a card. So basically the way you want to build this deck is either find a bunch of creatures that put counters on themselves or find a bunch of things that put counters on other creatures you control. So I'll go through some of the cool ones I have here. First up, Arbiter of the Ideal, 4 blue for a 4/5 Sphinx with flying. He has a really cool ability whenever Arbiter of the Ideal becomes untapped, so you're gonna have to attack with this basically to get this trigger on the next upkeep, but you reveal the top card of your library. If it's an artifact, creature, or land card, you put it onto the battlefield with a manifestation counter on it, and that permanent becomes an enchantment in addition to its other types. So I'm actually kind of surprised that this card doesn't see more play. This basically lets you cheat off the top of your library, either an artifact, creature, or land. Also extremely good in this deck because not only do you get that, you also get to draw the card with the manifestation counter off of your commander. Another really interesting one here, Geral the Fleshwright, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 human warlock. It says whenever you cast a spell during your turn, other than your first spell that turn, you create a 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature token. So that's always good. Just growing up your board of either attackers or blockers, whichever one you want. Also, he says whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So if you happen to be casting multiple spells per turn, you'll be creating those zombies that will then grow bigger depending on how many zombies you've put into the battlefield this turn. And then each of those that have a counter on it draws you a card off your commander. So drawing cards in this deck is not going to be a problem at all, especially when you have like engines like Geral out. Probably one of the best ones in the deck. I have Hexus, 6 mana for a 0/0 artifact creature construct with flying. Hexus enters the battlefield with 6 +1/+1 counters on it. You could pay 1, remove a +1/+1 counter from Hexus to put a flying counter on another target creature, thus triggering your commander, or you can pay 1, remove a counter from another creature you control to put a +1/+1 counter on Hexus. So the cool thing about this is you get to use your mana to move around your counters to draw more cards, but the best part about it is you don't have to tap to do this. So a lot of these cards are like once per turn, whenever you draw your second card each turn or cast your second spell each turn, you put a counter on it. So a card like Hexus just lets you use any mana that you want to basically be drawing cards, depending if you have a lot of creatures on the field. Possibly the best counter production card we have in the deck, Wizard class, 1 blue mana for an enchantment class. You have no maximum hand size for level 1. Pay 2 and a blue to get to level 2, and it says when this class becomes level 2, you draw 2 cards. Also, you can pay 4 and a blue to turn it to level 3, and that's the important part for us because it says whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So the only thing we need is when this is level 3, you put 1 counter from another source onto a creature you control, then this lets you put counters on every single one of your creatures because you're going to be drawing cards off of your commander, therefore growing your entire team by 1 and drawing you a card for each creature you haven't played. Just absolute insane value once this thing gets up to the 3rd level there. And in addition to the cards that put counters on things, I also threw in a small proliferate package in here. Probably one of the best ones in the deck's going to be Dreamtide Whale, 2 and a blue for a 7/5 whale. I don't know why they thought 7/5 would be a good one for this one, but it has Vanishing 2. It says this creature enters the battlefield with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove one of those time counters, and then when the last one's removed, you sacrifice it. But that's never going to be a problem because it also has whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you proliferate. So there's no way this is going to be getting down to 0 time counters on it. Everybody's going to be casting 2 spells during their turn. There's no way somebody's going to be like, oh, I'm not going to cast my second spell so that you can't proliferate. Even if they do that and you don't get theirs, you can also do it on your turn. So it's really not, it's never going to go away unless somebody kills it. And since we're drawing so many cards in the deck, I also threw a small payoff package for drawing cards, possibly one of my favorite cards in the entire format, Psychosis Crawler, 5 mana for a star Phyrexian Horror. It says Psychosis Crawler's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand, which is obviously going to be huge all the time because we're drawing so many cards so easily. Also, whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So there's a little bit of an alt win con in the deck. Plus, I just love this card. It's so much fun, especially in a deck that draws a lot, like a blue deck. Having a Psychosis Crawler out just absolutely mows down your opponents. I also threw in a couple cards like Sphinx's Tutelage, 2 and a blue for an enchantment. It says whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2 cards. If 2 non-land cards that share a color were milled this way, repeat this process. You can also pay 6 to loot, which you'll never do. So basically, whenever you put a counter on a creature, you draw a card, and then you have one of your opponents mill 2 cards. But if both of them were non-land and both of those cards shared a color, they do it again as many times as it takes for them to either hit a land or 2 separate colored cards. Basically, you just pick the monocolored player with this card, and it's pretty likely that unless they hit lands, you're going to be getting that trigger multiple multiple times per card draw. And seeing as how our commander draws so many cards, I didn't really think we needed that much external card draw outside of our commander, but I did throw a couple in here just in case our opponents happen to kill our commander a bunch of times we can't get it back out. So I threw in some interesting ones here. Moonring Mirror up first, 5-mana artifact. Says whenever you draw a card, exile the top card of your library face down, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile all cards from your hand face down. If you do, put all other cards you own exiled with Moonring Mirror into your hand. So you basically get to swap your hand with the cards that you exiled with Moonring Mirror, effectively doubling your draw. Another really fun one that also synergizes with the commander, Myoan of Seeing Winds, 7 blue, blue, blue. Yeah, I know it's 10 mana, but it's a cool card. I really like this one. It's a 3/3 spirit, and it says Myoan of Seeing Winds comes into play with a divinity counter on it if you played it from your hand. Also, Myoan of Seeing Winds is indestructible as long as it has a divinity counter on it, but you can remove that divinity counter from it to draw a card for each permanent you control, including your lands. So, late in the game, this could draw you, 10, 15, 20 cards or whatever, and hopefully if you have that with your Psychosis Crawler out, you can just end up killing all your opponents. Another pseudo card draw option, Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel. I happen to be putting this guy in so many decks just because he's so much fun to play. 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Siren Pirate with flash and flying. It says whenever Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel deals combat damage to a player, you put a chorus counter on it. That fulfills our commander's need for counters, which is also great. But then he loots, so you draw a card, discard a card, and then if there are 4 or more chorus counters on Malcolm, you may cast a discarded card for free. So especially with our proliferate effects in the deck, it's definitely worth it to have this guy in here. Not even to mention that he deals with counters, so you're drawing cards off your commander and off of Malcolm himself. The proliferate sub theme being really great for Malcolm there, but also for some of our artifacts that give us a lot of mana, like Astral Cornucopia. It's an XXX artifact, and it enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it. So you basically pay 3 mana, and it comes in with a charge counter. Then you choose a color, add 1 mana of that color for each charge counter on Astral Cornucopia. So if you happen to have the extra mana, you can dump a bunch of mana into this to kind of skip over the proliferate thing, but best to just do 3 mana, put this out early. Once you have your Dreamtide Whale going, every time you proliferate, you're adding the charge counters onto Astral Cornucopia, then it just produces more and more mana. Similar to that one, I got Replicating Ring, 3 mana snow artifact that says tap, add 1 mana of any color, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a night counter on Replicating Ring, that if it has 8 or more of those night counters, you remove all of them, and you create 8 copies of Replicating Ring. So again, if you're in a proliferate theme, Replicating Ring is a no-brainer, and it can get out of hand very quickly. Next up, we'll talk about some of the removal in the deck, possibly the best card in the deck when it comes to removal, Wave Goodbye, 2 blue, blue for a sorcery. Return each creature without a +1/+1 counter on it to its owner's hand. Now, normally I don't put in cards over $5. I think Wave Goodbye currently is sitting around $7 or $8. So only if cards are extremely good fits do I throw them in decks if they're, over the $5 range or somewhere like that. This basically is just a one-sided board wipe, similar to Cyclonic Rift, but I think it's a little less salty. For one, it's not instant speed. And if your opponents happen to have some counters on their creatures, they also get to keep them. So, there is some workarounds for it. And in addition to, your typical counter spells, negates, things like that, I thought I'd throw in Reject Imperfection, 1 blue, blue for an instant counter target spell. Then if that spell's mana value was 3 or less, you proliferate. So if you happen to counter a removal spell or something like that, which you normally want to be doing, you also get to proliferate. So, paying the 1 extra mana to tack on a proliferate to throw another counter on your Replicating Ring to get out that 8 mana a bit faster is definitely worth it in my opinion. Lastly, a really interesting card I have here, Musician, very old, 2 and a blue for a 1/3 human wizard, has cumulative upkeep 1. So if you don't know how cumulative upkeep actually works, it does put counters on the card that has cumulative upkeep. So at the beginning of your upkeep, you're putting age counters on the permanent, and then you have to sack it unless you pay its upkeep cost equal to the amount of age counters on it. So every single one of your upkeeps, you're going to put an age counter on this and then drawing a card. So that's really nice. But also it says you can tap it, put a music counter on target creature. If it doesn't have at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy this creature unless you pay 1 for each music counter on it. It gains that ability. So it's worded that way so it doesn't like stack for however many music counters are on the creature. So you can only put 1 per creature really to have that ability, but it's worth it to just throw some music counters over on your opponent's creatures. Last but not least, just a couple cards in the utility category I have to go over here. Just some cards that don't really fit into some of the other categories, but really help propel the deck forward. First one here, I threw in Gene Stealer Patriarch. This card is super cool. 4 and a blue for a 4/4 Tyrannid with Gene Stealer's Kiss. It says whenever Gene Stealer Patriarch attacks, you put an infection counter on target creature defending player controls, and then whenever a creature with an infection counter on it dies, you create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a Tyrannid in addition to its other types. So just really cool. I know it doesn't really fit the counter thing for your board because that's what Danny Pink cares about, but I thought, you're doing the counter thing already, so being able to throw over some infection counters onto your opponent's creatures and then kill them and steal them, just a really cool little niche card you can throw in a deck like this. Last but not least, though, I have Myoan of Cryptic Dreams, 5 blue, 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 so that's 8 mana for a 3/3 spirit. This one's one's a little bit better, I think, than the Seeing Winds Myoan, because it says Myoan of Cryptic Dreams enters the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it if you cast it from your hand. So this one actually comes in with an indestructible counter on it as opposed to the Divinity counter. So with the Cryptic Dreams one, you can actually move those counters around and give indestructible to your other creatures, as opposed to with the Seeing Winds one, you can't do that because it doesn't have the second clause that having the Divinity counter gives it the indestructible. So Cryptic Dreams is a lot better. Also, it says remove an indestructible counter from Myoan of Cryptic Dreams. You copy target permanent spell you control 3 times. This effect is absolutely insane, especially in a, I would say, pseudo big mana deck, since we have cards like Astral Cornucopia, Replicating Ring, things like that. We have the possibility of generating a lot of mana a little bit later in the game. So having these 8 mana, 10 mana spells, you know, it becomes a little bit more realistic in a deck like this to be happening more often. So that's pretty much the gist of my Danny Pink mono blue kind of aggro, kind of counters, drawing a ton of cards type of deck. Just really interesting. You don't really see this kind of build in mono blue very often. You know, mono blue commanders are usually more like reactionary as opposed to aggro, but this can definitely be an aggro deck with all the counters that we're throwing on things. I only went over a couple of them. There's like, I have like 25 cards that put counters on things. So if you're looking for a little bit of a different brew when it comes to mono blue, go ahead and click the link down below. I have the Architect link in my description. Feel free to leave a comment if there's a really important card that I missed in this video. But thank you guys so much for watching. Go ahead and leave a like on the video if you want to see more videos like this one. Subscribe if you like my content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Okay, take care.